All right, hello. So in this video, we're going to be talking a bit about how to specify text fonts and typefaces using CSS. So what we'll do is first we'll talk a little about specifying font typefaces and using font family. We'll also talk about using units and sizing fonts in CSS, and the units will also apply to sizing anything in CSS. And then we'll talk a little bit about style and weight, just because it's relevant to fonts. So we'll sort of include it all in one video. All right, so as we've seen in previous examples of CSS, we can specify the typeface, the font of a particular block of text by using the font family property. So for example, if we take our sort of standard little example here, I could specify that I want my paragraphs to have a font family of something like Helvetica. And when then I do that, of course, it changes it so that it's now a different font. It's Helvetica. When we're writing out font family, we'll generally put the name of the font in quotes, either single quotes or double quotes. It doesn't matter. But we'll basically put them in quotes because that way it supports fonts that might have multiple words in the name. So for example, if our font family was not Helvetica, but actually Helvetica New, I think is how we spell it, right? We can then use the quotes sort of indicate that that's like one term, right? That's the full name of the font that we're dealing with. You notice that it did change fonts a little bit. Now, the trick here is that when we specify a font is not inherent to a browser or actually even to a web page at all. Fonts don't come from the server. Fonts actually come from your computer. Each individual user's computer has its own set of fonts that it supports. On a Mac, for example, you can open up what's called the font book, which then lists all the fonts that are supported and installed by your operating system. It's installed on your computer. So every different computer has a different set of fonts available. Now, they're pretty standardized, right? Like all Macs have the same fonts. All Windows have generally the same font, but not always. And you can, of course, always go download and install more fonts if you want. Be careful with this, but like you can do that. So it's possible that we might specify the font that we want a page to render with might not actually be installed on that user's computer. So for example, maybe I want to use a font that's a Mac specific font. That's not going to work on a Windows machine. Maybe I want to use a Windows specific font that's not available on a Mac machine. So if I try specifying some font name that isn't actually installed in my machine. So for example, if I try to render something by using the non-existentica, right, font. Like, let's imagine that there's some font that doesn't actually exist. Existentica, that was a little better. If I try to say that's the font family I want to use, if I then refresh my page, you'll see that it doesn't actually render it in this. It doesn't go look up some font called non-existentica and like make it work. It just says that font doesn't exist. I don't know what you're talking about. And so the page just doesn't render that font at all. It just goes ahead and goes back to our Times New Roman sort of default font that our browser has. So because fonts might not be available on a user's computer, when we're specifying the font family in CSS, we also then provide a backup, sort of a secondary font that if the first one listed isn't available, use this other one instead. So for example, I might say, okay, well, if the non-existentica font doesn't exist, then fall back to just using Arial, right? Like Arial is a font that's likely available across most machines, maybe not all, but for most of them. So if the special font isn't around, instead use this Arial as sort of that other font, and let's use that instead. And then what will happen is, and we separate that with a comma. So we'll say like, great, here's the first font to use, comma, here's the backup if that's not available. And then of course, if we refresh our page, now Arial shows up as sort of the backup of what we're trying to do. Of course, it's possible that Area isn't there, right? Maybe, for example, this is another font I've made up called Arial New, and that one's not there, right? Again, doesn't work. So I can then, of course, create a third backup, Arial. And again, what the browser will do is it'll just go ahead and basically go through every font until it finds one that actually works, and then that's the font that gets rendered. So what you'll often see will be some special font name, and then you'll have something like Helvetica, and then you'll have something like Arial, and that's kind of like your fallbacks. So we go to using Helvetica, and then we go to Arial, and those two look, they're very close. They're hard to visually tell the difference. Okay. If these fonts don't exist, right? So if I've tried to do non-existentia, and I've tried to do Arial New, right? I've tried to use all these different fonts, but none of them exist on my computer. It's also possible to specify what is called a generic style. So this is not going to be like a font name, but it's going to be a category, a sort of classification of fonts. And there are 5 generic styles. I'll go over them in just a second. So we would write down the generic styling of that font as sort of the last thing on the list, right? It says if there's nothing else, just go with this basic generic, like just do whatever you want. These are not written with quotes around them because, again, it's not the name of a font. It's sort of the name of a category, of a generic type of font. So I might say, okay, fine. Well, if you don't have Arial New, just go ahead and use a sans serif font in the first place, which then, of course, here. So let me show it. Okay, if we try to do something having Arial New that doesn't actually exist, right, doesn't work, and then I can say, fine, fall back to my generic sans serif font. And then it falls back to a generic sans serif font, which in this case is, I think, Arial, actually. So again, we can basically list what are the fonts we want to apply, sort of one after another, ending with this generic font type at the end. Now, there are five different types of generic fonts that are available in web, and these are actually fairly consistent across most typeface-based interfaces. The 2 major categories, 2 most common you'll see, are what are called serif fonts and sans serif fonts. So my next slide, right? A serif is French for foot, Latin for foot, right? So a serif is going to be the little feet, the little things that stick out of a letter at the bottom of a bottom of a letter or top of a letter. So for example, you can see in the T, like my Times New Roman, I got little hooks on my T's, I've got little serifs on my G's, and the A's. Like you can see all the little serifs all over the font. So a serif font is going to be something like by generally Times New Roman, but there's also a number of other serif fonts as well. A sans serif font is a font that doesn't have serifs, so it doesn't have the little feet. These are going to be things like Arial, Verdanda, Helvetica, right? Again, they don't have the little feet, so you can't see those. Generally, when you're picking a font, it's going to be either a serif font or a sans serif font. Those are sort of the 2 most common categories we're dealing with when we're talking about fonts and typefaces. Browsers also support what's called a monospace font. Courier New is the default, but there's also some others like Monaco, which is the default font that Visual Studio uses. So if you've been doing coding in this, right, this font here, this font family is called monospace. Monospace means that each letter is the same space. They're monospaced, so that for example, if we look at our serif font, you'll notice that the I right here takes up a very little amount of space, but the M takes up a lot of space. Right? I can fit like 3 I's in the space of that M. In a monospace font, we don't have that. Each individual letter takes up the same amount of space, right? This I and the R take up the same amount of space here. Well, here, that's a very big example. So like if better example right here, right? My R and my M take up the same amount of space, right? My M and my I both take up the same amount of space. This is used in things like a lot of coding languages are usually monospace fonts because that way you can you don't have to worry about like character differences when you're writing out code that looks like things, right? All your spacing is always going to look the same. So webs also support generic fonts. There's a cursive font, which has sort of a brush script or Lucinda handwriting kind of font, right? These are ones that are going to look sort of fancy and scripty. And then you can have what are called fantasy fonts, which are generally going to be some other kind of weird thing going on here, right? I think Papyrus is the default fantasy font. So if I said that if my Arial New doesn't exist and I want to use fantasy fonts as my default, then my example defaults to the horrifying Papyrus font, right? Let me get that kind of effect. Just so you can see the example, right? If I go to default to a cursive font, right? My cursive font, again, is this, I think this is the Lucinda handwriting kind of font. So again, we can specify, whenever we specify a font family, we always want to specify a callback, a sort of fallback, right? In case the font doesn't exist. Even if you're doing something like Helvetica or Arial or Times New Roman, right? A font that's like a standard and you expect to be in every single computer, you still want to make sure you've got a generic fallback just in case somebody is on a particularly interesting kind of device that maybe doesn't have that font installed. Maybe they've deleted that font because they don't like it for some reason. Who knows? Like we don't know what the user's computer has done, so we want to make sure we have that fallback just in case. So for example, we might want to fall back to our sans serif font. Okay. So the most common distinction is with serif and sans serif fonts. There's a number, research is a little bit inconclusive about this, but the general understanding is that on the web, sans serif fonts are easier to read on screens. The line that I've heard in the past is that serif fonts are easier to read in like printed text, like books, because it helps users be able to identify words and sort of zap, sort of like visually move between them well a little bit. But on screens, you don't end up having that same kind of behavior because of how like aliasing sort of because how fonts get rendered and how it gets displayed on the screen. So that sans serif fonts actually end up being a little bit easier on the eyes and easier to read. So for users that, for accessibility reasons, right, for users with dyslexia, sort of again, I've seen research that suggests that sans serif fonts are easier to distinguish for people with dyslexia because there's less like weird little hooks and things going on with other fonts. So it's often seen as sort of better practice on the web to make things be sans serif fonts. And you'll see this in a lot of web pages, right? They'll sort of be designed to look that way. It's not to say that you have to make things sans serif. It's just that if you're trying to come up with a design decision, like how should I make my page look? Often it'll be more accessible if you want to make them sans serif. It's also easier for children to read, for example, is to read sans serif fonts. Helvetica being a standard, Arial, other similar ones as well. Cool. You'll notice actually, again, even the font that's built into my slides here, right, is a sans serif font. Mostly, it doesn't have actually any serifs involved, which you can sort of see with that. And again, because it's easier to read on the screen. Okay. So that's the basic idea with fonts. Again, you can sort of pick whatever fonts you want when you're developing a page. Generally, best practice is to go with stuff that's simple, standard, Helvetica, Times, right? Something basic. Don't try to get sort of really fancy with typefaces. That often again makes things more difficult to read, and it's not likely to work across lots of computers anyway. There's ways around that. You can actually like be able to tell computers to download particular fonts if you need a particular branding effect, but often you really don't want to do that. You want to stick with sort of standard fonts that are going to work across lots of different devices for, again, sort of accessibility reasons and support reasons. Okay. When we're specifying fonts, we can also specify the size of the font. Now, if you've ever worked with something like Word or sort of a word processor, you've probably specified fonts using point, right? You've said like 12-point font or 10-point font or 18 or 24 or 42-point font. In the web, you can technically use font points, right? So I could, for example, say that I want this to have a font size of 12 point, which again, will shift things around a little bit. 12-point is the standard size, right? If I don't specify anything, right? If I come down that sizing, 12-point is sort of your standard. Nothing has changed for your paragraphs. If I then want to say be smaller, right? Only be a 10-point font, then it shrinks it down. So points do work, but we actually don't use these very often in the web. In part because 12-point doesn't actually mean very much, right? Like what is a point is kind of unclear, particularly based on sort of sizings of screens and how that works. So while it makes sense on printed documents, it doesn't actually work in the web. So what we do instead is we specify fonts using a couple of different variations. The most common, sort of the basic way, if you don't want to specify anything else, is to use what are called pixels as your fonts. Now, pixels you can kind of think of them as like little dots on the screen. That's not what they are. They actually represent little areas, but pixels effectively a dot on the screen. So most browsers, all browsers have a default font size, right? If you don't specify the font size of like a paragraph, there is a default size that is going to get used. And for most browsers, that default size is 16 pixels. So again, if I give this thing a font size of 16 pixels, nothing changes, right? That's my default standard size. If you say 12-point, 12-point is basically just recalculated to be 16 pixels, so that it ends up meaning exactly the same thing, right? It's just a mathematical like scaling by some factor. Hence, we tend to use pixels all over the place instead of points because, again, pixels are just more standard across other dimensions we might work on a computer. So pixels are what are called absolute measurement, right? 16 pixels is going to be 16 pixels no matter what. 32 pixels will be 32 pixels no matter what, right? That's going to be like a sort of an absolute like predefined set of sizing. This will, of course, scale up as some monitors have higher resolution. A pixel might be a larger box, so 16 pixels might actually be like, in terms of the like size on your, the size on your screen, it might be bigger, but from our perspective, 16 pixels is always 16 pixels no matter what. However, when we're working with fonts, we generally don't actually want to use these absolute pixel values, because in part, if I say that I want this font to be 16 pixels, it's going to be exactly 16 pixels high no matter what the user has done. So if the user, for example, has said that, oh, the user, for example, has sort of poor eyesight and needs all fonts to be larger on their screen, the user could, for example, set their browser to say, please use a larger font. But if I've said I want my my font to always be 16 pixels, then that's going to end up overriding the user's kind of built-in style sheet. And then now, of course, means that the user has less control over making things readable for them. So we actually want to try to avoid using absolute values like pixels when we're measuring the sizing of elements. So what we generally use instead is to use what's called an EM for measuring our sizing. So an EM is a font size measurement that comes out of typography. In non-web contexts, an EM is the length of the letter M. So this length, right, however much space an M takes up, is considered an EM. Except in the web, EMs aren't variable, right? Because remember that we talked about that, like monospace fonts, the M's are one size versus in like a serif font, the M's are a different size. An EM doesn't change size based on the font. An EM is just going to be a relative size based on number of pixels. So by default, one EM, right? So if you think of like one like measurement unit, is going to be 16 pixels. So if I say I want my font size not to be 16 pixels, but to be one EM, this is going to give me the exact same size. If I then want to make it bigger, I can use a bigger number of units. I might say I want this to be 2 EMs worth. You can think of, again, an EM a little bit like, when we talk about the difference between EMs and pixels, it's a little bit like the difference between, say, centimeters and inches, right? If I go from 1 inch to 3 centimeters, if I want to double that size, I multiply it by 2, right? When you say 2 M's, you can think of it as like, oh, that's 2 inches is now like 6 centimeters, or roughly, right? You can manage these things together. So if I go to 2 EMs, right, that makes my font twice as big. It's now 2 EM size. Similarly, I can do like 1.5 EMs to go sort of 1.5. You'll often see this go down to even to like 1.25 EM. I generally don't see, you can, sorry. You can sort of get to this beat. That was weird. 1.5, that big. 1.25, that big. There we go. I generally don't see, you can go as high decimal precision as you want. I generally don't see it go more than like quarters, right? Then more than like hundredths of a percentage. But again, you can do this however you want. Now, the thing that makes EMs interesting is that EM is actually going to be, even though it defaults to being an EM being 16 pixels, it's actually based on the size of the parent element. So it's going to look at saying how big is the sort of the font, the current element's font, and then when we get to the next element down, it's going to say, what is that? Let's take the EMs and increase that size. So for example here, is in my section here, right, I've got my div styled, right, and then the paragraph inside of that. If I talk about saying that I want my, let me go this back to being default, right? If I say I want my styled div to have a font size that is going to be, let's call it 16 pixels. We're hard-coded for now, right? That gives me my styled thing has, again, the same size as everybody else. If I then make that paragraph that's inside the styled div, so again, I'm using my descendant selector here in order to talk about paragraphs that are inside that, paragraphs that are inside that styled element. If I have his font size be 1 EM or 2 EM, then I'm saying take the parent element size, take this div size, which was 16 pixels, and the paragraph's size should be double that, should be twice what the parent's size was, which means that this paragraph's font size will now be 32 pixels because it's going to be twice the size of my styled block. And then you can see that, right? So here's the sort of unstyled version, and then here's the styled version that's twice as big. Now, the distinction here, though, is that if my parent was actually larger, if my parent was actually 20 pixels wide, then now, because I'm using this relative EM font, my EM is actually going to be twice as big as that. So that means that this paragraph, instead of having a size of 32, right, twice of 16, my paragraph will now have a size of 40 pixels, right, twice of 20. So again, if I now increase the size of my styled element, even though my paragraph is still just 2 EM, right, I haven't actually changed that styling, the font still gets even bigger. So the reason we end up using EMs is because EMs will be based on sort of the overall size of the page. So that if I say that I want my overall body of my page, for example, to have a font size that's 18 pixels, or I basically want my default font sizing not to be 16, but to be a little bit bigger, 18, then that makes all of my sizing inside of it scale, right? So now instead of having my paragraph having to say that this was 32 pixels, by saying I just want to increase the size of my body, because I've now used EMs, my paragraph is going to also increase in size, right? Everything sort of scales together, right? So when we say I want my page to be bigger, the whole page gets bigger and everything sort of scales and grows in an effective way. So this is what's called a relative font size, which means that, again, it's going to be relative to that parent's font size. It tends to be best practice. When we are writing sizes for fonts, we're generally going to be using EMs to measure how big we want those fonts to be, because that way you can say, I want this section to be larger, and sort of all the fonts will increase in a sort of, they'll sort of all grow at the same rate. So you don't having some things get bigger and some things don't get bigger. It makes it easier for pages to grow together. Now, of course, you then might get this thing where I've said that I want my styling, right? For my body's font size was, my default font size is 16 pixels, right? That's my body's default. If I then had my style block say, well, you should be, 2 EMs, right? You should be twice that big. So this div area say be twice as big as that. And then I can say I want my paragraph inside it to be now twice as big as the thing inside of it, right? My body is now 16 pixels, which means that my div inside of it is now 32 pixels. And now the paragraph is twice of that, which means my paragraph is actually 64 pixels high, which means that my paragraph is now huge. It's really, really big. So EMs can cause this kind of like dramatic scaling, right? Where I've said, okay, make this box, make this div a little bit bigger, and then make the paragraph even bigger than that. But that can actually lead to sort of this like multiplicative increase in size, which maybe is not what we want. So often what we'll do instead is, instead of trying to use EMs all over the place, I'm instead going to use a measurement called an REM, which is not saying about dreams. It's basically saying that we're going to have our scale be twice the font size, not of the parent element, right? So not of this styled thing, but twice the font size of my root element, of my body or my HTML, sort of the basic sizing of the page, which again, by default is 16 pixels. So if I say be 2 REM, then my font size now is not taking 16 double to 32, double to 64. It's now just going to double it once to 32. And so now I get sort of this nice 32 size font paragraph. REMs work great because they mean that you don't have to have this like, well, I don't have to sort of know the sizing of all my intermediate elements, right? I don't have to have the parents grow and the kids grow and then everything else grows and grows and grows. But I can still use a relative font. So if the user says, make all the fonts on my page a little bit bigger, this will all scale in a clean and effective way. So we generally will use REMs unless we want to have some kind of scaling effect. So REMs and EMs are the ways that we'll tend to measure fonts. REMs are a little bit newer in the language of CSS, and by newer I mean within the last decade or so. So often older websites you might see written using EMs as fonts. That's not necessarily saying they're bad, but often if you then replace those with REMs, you'll tend to get slightly better behavior, though you may have to like rescale some things because people may have increased their EM size without realizing that there's this multiplicative approach, where things have sort of doubled in lots of different places. And again, you can think of this as like, this is now adding another unit, right? We've now moved from centimeters to inches to, I don't know, snail's length, like some other random unit that we've now made up, but it scales in the same way, right? It says use 2 of those things, use 3 of those things, use 2.5 of those things, and those all increase in kind of the way that we might expect. Okay. It's also possible to specify things using percentages. So for example, I could say, instead of saying be twice the parent's size, right, being 2 EMs, take the parent size and be twice of that, I could instead say, have my font size be 200%, which says take the parent size and be twice as big as that, right? Be 200% of that size, right? Or say be 150% of the parent size. So saying 150% in a font size and saying font size of 1.5 EM, these two things are identical. They are doing exactly the same work, right? They're saying take the parent size and go 150% of that, right? 1.5 times. Take the parent's font and go 1.5 times. So a percentage works exactly the same way. Now, we don't actually end up using percentages with font sizing. Not because it doesn't work, it's just not considered good practice, right? Because then you get to this question of, well, when I say 150%, like, how do I be consistent with saying percentages versus EMs versus REMs? Like, how am I sort of measuring these units correctly? So we tend not to use percentages when specifying font sizes. We're always going to specify units like EMs or REMs, or worst case, pixels. But percentages will get used for things like width and height and sizing. So if, for example, I want to specify that I want an image to be half the size of its parent box, right? So if I have a div that contains an image inside of it, And I don't think I have one on my page. I don't have one on my page to show. But if I want my, well, here I can put one in. Let's add a quick image. Go Joel. So a paragraph in here, and we'll have an image. And my source can be this image. I think it's a puppy. Yep, I got a husky in here. Husky.png. Alt. Thank you, puppy. There we go. Oh. Image husky. Oh, not PNG, sorry. JPEG. There we go. So there's my puppy. We're all good. If I instead, here, let me get rid of the font. Well, I'll probably keep the font size in there. If I want my image size to be the same as my parent, I could, for example, give my image a width of 100%. And now my image stretches to now be the same size as its parent, right? That paragraph was filled up my page with a block element. So now my image fills out that page as well. If I want my image to only be a quarter of the parent size, now my image is only a quarter. So I can put 4 of these images next to each other and they'd all fit across the page. You could specify image widths in terms of EMs, but again, an EM is 16 pixels. So if I said I want my image width to be, 0.25 EMs, or I don't know, 0.25 EMs, that means that my image is now only 4 pixels wide, which doesn't really, sorry, I forgot the unit, that's the problem. Right, now my image is only 4 pixels wide, because that's, again, a quarter of 16. If I tried to say 4 EMs, again, it's small. So we generally don't use EMs for sizing of things. We use them for font sizing. So fonts are going to be used in EMs or REMs. Percentages are going to be used more for like width and height dimensions. That's what the only place you'll want to see percentages. And again, you can always convert this into pixels as needed, because in the end, the browser converts all units into pixels to actually figure out like how it needs to lay stuff out on the screen. So again, takeaway, when you're specifying font sizes, often you'll want to use the root element size, which is what REMs are. So when, for example, if you're doing homework and it says use root element size, that's what REM is. Or you can use EMs for specifying font sizes, and then you can use percentages or pixels when you're specifying things like width and height. All right, cool. The last thing that I need to note about fonts is that we can, in addition to specifying how big fonts are, let me get back to my fonts here. Let's make these things maybe a little bit not so huge, so I can see them. All right, there's my fonts. We can specify things like the style, which specifies things make italics, or the weight, which makes them bold. So for example, I could say I want my paragraphs here have a font style that is italic, and that then makes it italic. We can give it a font weight, bold, and that then makes it bold. Font style, italic or non-italic. That's, if you don't specify it, it's not italic. If you do specify it is italic. Boldness, font weight, is actually specified. There's actually lots of different ways of doing bold. There's actually lots of different measures of boldness. So there's basic bold. There is, let's see, there's other ways of explaining this. There is other bold. There's actually also a less bold. There's a light, which is going to be like not bold. All right, so again, here's light. Here's, oh, yeah, that didn't show up. Is it light? All right. Sometimes the keywords don't work. So bold is sort of the keyword you can use. There's also then the way that font weight is generally measured is actually by using a number. So if I say 400 as my font weight, that's sort of normal value, right? That's everything's the same. Versus 700 makes it bold. If I go lighter to like 300, that makes it thin, right? So again, here's my thin version. There's my normal version. See how it gets thinner, right? And you can actually have my font weight go down, I think even down to 100 even, right? Maybe not. 100, 300. Yeah, so 300 is about as low as you can get. I mean, you can get lower, but it's not always, 300 is about as low as you can get. You can go really, really dark, right? So you can go from 300, you can go up to 900, right? Really bold versus sort of 700, which is only kind of bold. And again, for these fonts, the really bold and the kind of bold actually end up looking the same. So to be clear, what sort of shows up in this demo is that the first thing to note is that, again, we have these different levels of boldness, and I have this sort of example of this one font that supports those, where you can have like black, which is with the, or bold 700. There's actually black, it's even darker. Black is the 900 level. And then you can have different levels of thinness, right? Medium is like 500, regular is 400, light is 300, and you have sort of scaling it back down. So there's a couple things to note out of this. It's worth noting that, again, when you're specifying boldness, there's different levels of boldness. All these values they're not actually measuring like a scale of 1 to 1,000. They're actually just these special numbers that indicate different boldness, right? So while I could say that there's a boldness of 500, there isn't a boldness of 549, right? That ends up meaning the exact same thing, right? So your boldness is either going to be one of these sort of 100 level values, right? 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900. Right, so we can go back. 400, I think it actually moves the same way. The other thing to then note is that when we specify boldness, or actually when we specify italics, it isn't actually scaling the font by making the letters thicker. So when I say make a font bold, you're not actually saying take all the letters and like increase the thickness of that letter. What you're actually doing is loading in a different typeface. So a bold version of a typeface is actually a different font than the not bold version of that typeface. Where what's happened is that when someone's designing the typeface, they're saying, here's what the letter S should look like, right? They say a letter S should look like this. It has this level of curve. But when you then make it bold, you're going to actually change the styling of that letter. You're going to make it look distinct. You're not going to make it thicker. You're going to make it look different, right? Now, maybe that just means making the letters thicker, but it also might mean actually changing the layout and structure. Like, what parts of the letter do you make thicker, right? Do you make the stem of the H thicker than you make the sort of the hoop of the H, right? How is that going to apply? And that's going to change based on the font. You can see this a bit with italics. It's really obvious with italics, right? Italics is not just going to say take a letter and like slant it. Italics is actually saying, let's take and make a different font in which the letters are all kind of shifted to the side, right? So if you look at our normal version of this, right, my A here has this kind of the thing where we have a letter and then a little hook on the top, right? That's my A in a normal font looks like. But when I go to an italic font, I don't just slant that A. I'm actually creating a brand new style of A, right? One that has a loop, my two little sort of feet at the top and the bottom, almost serif's leg. Again, these are two distinct letter A's. It's not that one is slanted and one is not. They're actually distinct fonts or distinct typefaces. So I mention this only because it's worth noting that, like, if you say make an italicized version of this special font, it's possible that there isn't an italicized version of that font, and that's why things don't go slanty, right? If I try to take my magic font, like my non-existentica, if I try to say make an italicized version of that, if there isn't an italicized version of that font, nothing's going to slant. It's not going to matter. So if I try to make a bold version of this, if there isn't such a thing, it's not going to matter, right? When I tried making myself, because I'm using my default sans serif, when I tried making it really bold, right, making it black, it just made it bold. It didn't make it really bold because there isn't a really bold version of that Arial font. So this is almost kind of the like interesting thing to note about font typefaces and sort of dealing with various fonts, but it's worth also just kind of keeping an eye out and keeping sort of in your back of your head maybe that typefaces are going to work a little bit different than you might sort of expect. Okay. And that's the basics of adding typefaces. Again, the really important takeaway here, right? The thing to note is that when you're specifying font family, you're going to provide a list of your fonts, all the font names in quiet quotes, tends to be best practice. And then you can have your generic font at the end that's not inside of quotes. And then remembering that when we're styling units, we're going to use that using EMs or REMs for specifying the size and the height of different fonts. Thanks.